This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Clint Burnett. Clint is a visiting scholar at Boston College and a priest in the Anglican Church of North America, serving in Knoxville, Tennessee. He is the author of several books, including the brand new Paul and Imperial Divine Honors, out now on Eerdmans Press, in which he challenges the prevailing theory in New Testament scholarship that there was one single monolithic imperial cult of the Caesars against which the early Christians fought. He carefully examines the archaeological evidence and presents a much more nuanced picture of divine honors in the imperial cult. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Burnett, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here, Alex, and please call me Clint.
Okay, that is great, man. Well, Clint, I'm very excited to talk to you about this book. Tell us about yourself and your background and your work before we get into it, because you are a very busy man.
Yeah, so I describe myself as a Christian, a husband, a father, an Anglican priest, a financial advisor, and a New Testament scholar. Basically, as a Christian priest and New Testament scholar, I'm really interested in the world that birthed early Christianity and attempting to interpret early Christianity in light of that world. And so I'm most interested in looking at the material remains that have survived from it and reconstructing the past that way. That's what I do in my part-time. I'm also an Anglican priest, as I mentioned, and then a full-time financial advisor throughout the week.
Yeah, so it definitely keeps you busy in your job here.
Indeed.
But you're obviously a biblical scholar, and that's your background here. This book is a very thorough work, and I am just to kind of preface this conversation here. It is a little technical, but I think you do a really great job of breaking down the big ideas as you go throughout your work. And obviously, it took a lot of time and effort into producing. So, what motivated you to write Paul and Imperial Divine Honors?
Yeah, so when I first when I was introduced to what I refer to as the Imperial cult back in the spring semester of 2010 at Harding School of Theology, where I did my Master of Divinity, I thought that the Imperial cult was just the answer to everything. Christology, persecution of early Christians. I mean, it was sort of the one-size-fits-all solution for me. And then, thanks be to God, I was able to delve in, study, read through. I mean, I came to that conclusion because a lot of the secondary literature that I was reading at the time. And then when I got into the primary sources for what people call the Imperial cult, what I like to call, and I'll explain to you in just a moment, Imperial Divine Honors, it was just I noticed this sort of widespread misconception about the so-called Imperial cult and just historically inaccurate interpretations of it by New Testament scholars that I read and was influenced by, and then passed on in term papers and whatnot. So what I wanted to do is kind of right or wrong, if that makes sense, or present a more accurate assessment. I was fortunate enough during my PhD to be able to excavate and to be even to be a square supervisor. And so I would do a lot of reading about what archaeology is and those types of things. And I came across something one time that's really stuck with me. It's basically what we're doing is we're digging up the past, and we have an obligation. We can only do it once. Because when you excavate, everybody who ever has knows that once you disturb something, then you lose its context. And so you have to be really careful, and because what you want to do is be able to retell that story as accurately as possible. And so I've just really stuck with me. And so even something like the worship of the Roman emperor as a god or as God with a lowercase g, I think that story and the people who are involved in it deserve to have their stories told accurately.
Yeah. Well, you do kind of come out swinging in your book. You make a very provocative statement at the beginning that there is no centralized imperial cult. And as you kind of alluded to before, like going back to 2007, 2008, 2009, that era, almost all of Pauline scholarship, at least Christian Pauline scholarship, was united in the idea that there was this one imperial cult, and that is the background for everything in early Christianity. And I've noticed that, like, especially over the last couple of years, a lot of American Christians that try to make political applications of the Bible will appeal to that monolithic imperial cult, but you argue that there is no centralized imperial cult. So before we get started, what do you mean by that there's not one cult?
Yeah, so aside from a handful of mentally unstable Roman emperors didn't pass an empire-wide law or edict demanding to be worshipped either before or after their deaths. So that's the first thing. I mean, there's no sort of centralized imperial cult. What you actually have with this so-called imperial cult are countless grants of civic or cultic honors, rather, for Roman emperors and their families that provinces, cities, associations, and individuals provided for them of their own volition for various purposes and according to their own customs and traditions. And so because of that, that's kind of why I like to use the term imperial divine honors. It gets us thinking in the plurality and not the singular. So I'll refer to a grant of imperial divine honors for a particular person.
Yeah, and you set this up really well earlier in your book by giving us some archaeological and background evidence, and you explore the way in which two cities, and I think I'm pronouncing this right, Gythium, is that the correct way to pronounce that city?
Gythium, Guthium, it doesn't matter. One's a Roman pronunciation, one's the Greek.
Okay, perfect. All right, so Gythium in Rome, and you look in the opening chapter the way in which those two cities in the Roman Empire celebrate imperial divine honors. What does the historical evidence from those two cities tell us about the diversity of imperial divine honors?
Yeah, so those two cases, so I just chose two particular cases of two particular grants of imperial divine honors out of the myriad ones that existed in the first century AD. And so what I try to do in those particular cases sort of set the scene. I looked at two particular grants of divine honors for the Emperor Augustus from two particular cities, one a Greek city and one the city of Rome. And it shows us basically that imperial divine honors at the civic level was the result of legislative processes in keeping with each particular city's unique traditions and customs, and all for the purpose, in these particular cases, of showing appropriate gratitude to the Emperor Augustus for what he's done, in particular here after his death. And so they just really do a really good job of painting the two main types of grants of imperial divine honors that St. Paul would have encountered in mainland Greece, which is the hub and the focus of the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, one of the things that you do that is very helpful towards the beginning of your book, too, is you actually define what imperial divine honors means, and then you kind of explain what all is wrapped up in imperial divine honors. And this is something that, as you know very well, a lot of New Testament scholars throw around this term, and it doesn't matter if it's like whatever, justification, apocalyptic. There are all these words that New Testament scholars use, but every New Testament scholar has a slightly different definition for each of those terms, and they don't always explain what they mean by that. So you anchor your definition of imperial divine honors very early on in the book. What do you mean by imperial divine honors? What does it entail?
Yeah, so I was able to come to my definition of it basically from trying to look at the ancient data for it. So inscriptions, coins, ancient literary sources, those types of things, and archaeological sites too. And so from all those and from my familiarity with them over the last 14 years, I just define them as any cultic act to, or in some cases on behalf of or for, a Roman emperor or one of his family members, and it can include any one of the following. Okay, so priests or priestesses, processions, prayers, sacrifices, and those can be something as large as an ox or a cow of some kind, and something as small as some incense. And then wine would also be included in that. Hymns, we know there were imperial cultic hymns, altars dedicated to various emperors and their family members, festivals on their behalf and for them, games. So this would include gladiatorial combats, which are almost always in the early Roman Empire, always connected to imperial divine honors. Statues, not necessarily statues where emperors look and depicted as a god. One of the cultic statues of Augustus from Corinth, for example, pictures him in a very pious manner as a Roman priest, basically. He's got his toga pulled up over the back of his head. And then divine titles would be one. So inscriptions or coins that will call an emperor or a member of the imperial family a god. Shrines to them, which are not an actual temple, but just a dedicated space that someone consecrates for imperial cultic activity. There was one at Corinth, for example, inside of the main judicial building of the city called the Julian Basilica, and then temples. And so I also want to point out that just because one city or one province or even one person decrees one of these cultic acts doesn't mean you get all of them. So that's kind of what, as two, I define and then make certain that I say, just because someone's got a priest doesn't necessarily mean there's a temple there. It does mean there's an altar there. It does mean probably there's sacrifices are being altered or offered, prayers are being made, but it doesn't necessarily include games. It may not include a cultic image, and it may not include a divine title. So just trying to be as precise as possible and not going beyond the claims of the ancient sources that we have.
Yeah, and almost all of our ancient sources can be divided up into one of two categories. You either have your textual sources or your physical, your archaeological sources. And as you note in your book, in New Testament scholarship, many New Testament scholars rely almost entirely on written sources. So they're looking at text and documents, and that's how they reconstruct their understanding of the imperial cult in Rome. But in your book, you look more at the archaeological evidence. You're examining coins, you're examining inscriptions and things of that nature. And you claim, too, that actually gives us a better or more nuanced presentation of imperial divine honors than some of the textual evidence. So will you walk us through that? What is it about the archaeological or the physical evidence that might be superior or more accurate or nuanced than the textual evidence?
So the vast surviving literary sources that talk about imperial divine honors are associated with the city of Rome. And it makes sense because that Rome was a city that determined the destiny of the Mediterranean world, basically from the close to the 3rd century BC onward. And so it's the city that most people were interested in. And most of the literary sources for imperial divine honors are what we call more generalized or kind of more universal histories, biographies, those types of things. They don't there aren't a collection of local histories, which we know existed, and people, as they would write their larger sort of universal histories, would use the local ones. And those are the ones that probably had references to imperial divine honors, which we just don't have them anymore because people can copy them. And so what we're left with, if you look at just the literary sources, is we're top heavy with Rome, and we're top heavy with what goes on there. And so if you just read that and then you go and you try to figure out what's going on in Ephesus, for example, or Philippi or Corinth, you're going to be left with a very different picture than what is actually happening on the ground. And so for imperial divine honors, one of the best source to use to reconstruct it are material remains from the 1st century or from the time period that you're studying. So this would be archaeological sources, the things that excavators have dug up in controlled scientific excavations. It would be coins, the study of which is called numismatics, and these were like vehicles of ancient propaganda and official communiques that not just Rome, but the provinces also minted coins, and cities, they also minted coins. And we're so blessed that if you go to rpc.org, I think, UK, or just Google Roman provincial coinage, they've done an amazing job. Every single coin is up there. That we have. There are a lot of coins, I guess, that we do not have, but the ones that we do have, you can see pictures, and so they've made it super easy to access those. And if your city built a temple, oftentimes you'd put it on a particular coin, or if your province provided a temple, if there was an imperial temple, you'd put it on a coin. So some of the reasons we know about temples are just because they're on the backs of coins. There's a statue group that probably was in the city of Philippi, and we know about it not because they found evidence of it, but because it's on coin, which is super cool. And then you have the thing that I focused on the most in my academic work is inscriptions, and this would be any ancient message that's engraved, written, or scratched, most often on a durable material, and most often, there are exceptions to both of these, to preserve the text for more than a lifetime. So you get some text saying we want to write this for forever, basically. And so I would say that these sources provide a more accurate presentation because they give us the advantages that the written documents don't. First is they're unaltered witnesses of the past, and they represent what someone actually did or said, not what someone said someone did or said. And then the second main advantage that they have is that they are able to provide us with actually what people did in particular places at particular times, which we all know that not all, for the example, the United States of America, we are not a uniform country. We're a very diverse country. We know that trends come and go, and we sort of know this in our own world, and we don't think that that happened in the first century, for example. We always think and paint with broad brushes, and we'll use things that have sort of timed out or people have moved from and make particular arguments to interpret the Bible. And so inscriptions can allow us to date with precision certain fads, certain trends, but also local customs and traditions that didn't get recorded or got recorded, and those books just didn't survive because they don't focus on sort of the universal histories.
Yeah, and one of the great selling points for this book too, and I would recommend this to my audience, is that you include pictures of a lot of these coins, and a lot. I mean, there's so many pictures in the book, but it makes your argument come alive in that sense, because you say, like, look, you can look at these coins here and you write about it in the text, and then you flip the page over and you can see a picture of that coin with the writing and everything right there. And it really does kind of bring that down to earth. You know, it's not just an abstract idea, which is something that I really appreciated about your book here. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about too, before we start getting into your analysis of some of the individual cities and how they handled imperial divine honors, was the way in which other New Testament scholars have traditionally approached imperial divine honors. And again, we've kind of already set this up a little bit. There's been a lot of sweeping generalizations, and I know towards the end of this interview, I want to ask you specifically about N.T. Wright, because I think he's kind of the worst at making sweeping generalizations about the imperial cult. But you look at like Bruce Winter, and I really like Bruce Winter's work. You look at N.T. Wright, you look at some Marxist scholars. In general, what have New Testament scholars said about imperial divine honors?
Yeah, so in general, what New Testament scholars will do is they will paint with that big broad brush that I was talking about, and they'll interpret imperial divine honors as if it were part of and consisted of one uniform, centrally controlled imperial cult, and that you have the emperor in Rome determining who worships whom, when and where, and how. And so just not the case. And for them, some people do try to have a degree of contextualization, but their degree of contextualization will consist of just finding one example of one coin or one inscription from a particular city and say, oh, this particular city worshiped Claudius, for example. That means all cities did, which is just not correct. I mean, when you look at the ancient sources and you actually see what cities produced, what has survived, you can actually see. And it's so part of the problem, I think, is the fact that New Testament scholars have dipped their toes into the classical world and done so in an uninformed way. So if you read, since the late 19th century, classicists have been producing works on the imperial cult. One of the first ones was in French. I forgot the title of it, but it was in the late 19th century. And people have been talking about what they call the imperial cult. But they're really careful to make the distinction to say what they really mean when they say imperial cult is this is just a term that we use, but what it actually means is there are countless cults that they usually break down into 4 different categories. Cults in Rome are distinct and colonies of Rome, cults in provinces, cults that are in particular Greek cities, and then the least studied imperial cults of all, or grants of imperial divine honors, as I prefer, would be the private ones that individuals did. And so classicists have known this, and this is sort of the definition that they work with. And then when New Testament scholars began to pick up the work of Simon Price, God rest his soul, who published the sort of seminal work that brought imperial divine honors back to the forefront of classical scholarship in 1984, which happens to also be the year of my birth. Coincidence? I don't know. But they began to read his work, because it's entitled Imperial Cult, and interpret it as if in a way that Price never intended. If you read him carefully, he makes distinctions between cults in Rome, cults in provinces, cults in cities, and cults that individuals have. And so I think that's part of it. It's just a desire to get into the classical world and understand it better, but one that was unsophisticated and not trained to know, hey, this is part of this larger conversation, and there are a few things that you need to know when you get into this conversation.
Yeah. Well, you label your approach to imperial divine honors the contextual approach. So describe how this helps us to categorize imperial divine honors throughout the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so I didn't come up with that approach. It's one that classicists, like I said, have worked with since the late 19th century. But what it does is it means that we approach every single source for imperial divine honors, whether it's an archaeological site, inscription, coin, or even a literary source, as a local datum representing an imperial cultic act from the place whence it comes. So whether it's a city of Rome, whether it's a province, whether it's a city, or whether it's someone's house, that we approach that that document, that artifact, whatever it is, and we interpret it in light of its own self first and foremost, and not create this sweeping generalization and say because this person had a statue of Tiberius and his mother in his house in the city of Ephesus that everybody did, or that everybody across the empire did, and those types of things. So it basically means it's sort of like I compare it to interpreting Paul's epistles. We wouldn't read St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians in light of his epistle to the Corinthians, or his first epistle to the Corinthians, or his first epistle to the Thessalonians. So we wouldn't do that, but we're sort of doing that when you interpret it non-contextually, or an artifact that represents a grant of imperial divine honors. We're sort of doing that when we just generalize from that, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And the three cities that you choose to look at in your book are Philippi, Thessalonica, and Corinth. And obviously, Paul wrote letters. I mean, two that we have to Thessalonica and two that we have to Corinth. Probably more to both of those cities, but we have two of them included in the canon of Scripture. And in your book, you kind of systematically go through each of those cities and just explore the background, the evidence, and everything like that. And you draw some very compelling and very interesting claims that do challenge a lot of the mainstream consensus about how Paul would have understood imperial divine honors and the churches in those cities' relationship to imperial divine honors. You start with Philippi. Philippi is a Roman colony. And I know that for a lot of like casual readers of the Bible, or for maybe people that were brought up in church and that were taught to read the Bible devotionally, that might be like an interesting historical fact, but they don't think about how Philippi being a Roman colony really does shape the way that people live there in a kind of way that it wouldn't for people in other parts of the Roman Empire. So talk to us about the political arrangement of Philippi being a Roman colony and how that would contribute to how they would have understood imperial divine honors.
Yeah, so I mean, because it became a colony in 42 BC and then reestablished again around 31 BC, it fundamentally changed. So that when it became a colony, that meant the people who had land and the people who had homes inside the city, they were dispossessed of those homes. So it wasn't just, hey, your status gets changed. You go from a municipality in the United States to a town or a city. It's just that not only does that change, but your charter changes, the civic government changes, and your land gets taken and given to someone else, particularly given to soldiers whom Augustus discharges, and before him, Mark Antony discharges, and also people who got their land taken away in Italy. So right out of the gate, it means so much more than people just glance over it. Oh, yeah, it's a colony of Rome. It was a center of Roman thought, culture, and ideology, which includes what we would call religion. And the material culture from the city bears this out. So if you go to the city and you look at what's there from basically 42 BC all the way up to the end of the first century, think of a world in which the public script is all in Latin. Even though it's in the middle of Greece, it's all in Latin. All of the civic officers, titles, all that stuff, it's in Latin. It's not in Greek. And so you're dealing with what is essentially supposed to be, it's described as a part of Rome that basically gets transferred all the way here. I mean, they even found the city the same way that they founded the city of Rome back in 753 BC. And they mint coins. The city of Philippi minted coins showing the plowing of the city boundaries basically by a priest with oxen. So this is something that I find so amazing. People don't really give Luke the credit that he deserves, in particular the author of Acts of the Apostles. It's because with Philippi, it's the one place where he stops and says it's a colony of Rome. And if you look then at the charges that are brought against St. Paul and St. Silas, is that they are advocating customs unlawful for we Romans to accept and practice. So St. Luke got it because he was there, I think, and sort of knew, right? That's where one of the wee sections of Acts begin, right before there. And so the impact of this, it should change how we approach the interpretation of the letter first and foremost, because not everybody to whom Paul wrote read Latin. Probably most didn't, but there are a few Latin names that are mentioned. I think close to 3 or 4 that are mentioned in his epistle to the Philippians that we have in the canon. St. Polycarp says that he wrote letters plural. Some people have taken that to say that Philippians is more than one letter. I don't think it is. I think there are probably more that he wrote. He really loved the Philippian church, and so he probably wrote more letters than what we have. But that should just impact everything, and it really impacts the imperial divine honors that were going on in the city itself, because Rome had its own distinct version of imperial divine honors. They basically reserved imperial divine honors for an emperor or an imperial family member who did a really good job in their role. So someone who ruled the empire well. So if you think about it, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Claudius. That's it for the Julio-Claudians. This means Tiberius was not worshipped in Rome after his death. That means that Caligula was not, and Nero was not. And so there's this great quote from Tacitus that where a sycophantic senator even tries to pass divine honors for Nero. And he says, no, because we worship dead emperors. And if you pass divine honors for me, that's a harbinger that someone's going to kill me or I'm going to die. And so what you have is you've got imperial divine honors in Philippi, which basically the material culture, so the inscriptions, the archaeology, and the coins bear this out really, really well, is most often what the people of Philippi waited to do is they waited till an emperor died, and they waited until the Senate either determined that he was what's called a divus or a diva, if it's a lady, whether or not they were basically divinized. And if they were divinized, then Philippi followed suit and established a grant of imperial divine honors for them. The one exception in Philippi also proves the rule. There's one grant, there's one inscription that shows that there was a priest for Tiberius in the city, but that priesthood it postdates his death. So the city did not call him a divus. They just called him Tiberius, but they called Claudius and they called Nero. They called Claudius, they called Augustus, and they called Julius Caesar. They called them both Divus Julius, Divus Augustus, and Divus Claudius. And so also say there's no one-to-one translation of divus into Greek. Most often Greek speakers translated it as theos or thea for diva, but the concept of a divus didn't exist in Greek. And so that's a really complex topic, but that will be important for the city of Corinth.
The next point that I want to make that you address in this chapter is going to be one that might step on some of my listeners' toes, because I think that Paul uses terms like Lord and Savior and gospel. And it's been very common to assume, and I think N.T. Wright is largely responsible for this in evangelical circles. I can't remember what the name of that article, Paul's Gospel and Caesar's Empire. That was it. The article that he published, it was kind of the starting point for this conversation, at least among, more like traditional Christians and evangelicals. Mm-hmm. But N.T. Wright in that article makes the claim that like this language was also language that was employed by the imperial cult. So even though terms like Savior and Evangelion might have deep roots in the Greek Old Testament, there's also a parallel to the imperial cult, and that Paul is kind of deliberately using those words to play on that, to kind of show that, okay, if Jesus, and this is his famous formulation, if Jesus is Caesar, or if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not. But you argue that there's actually no evidence in Philippi, and even though all three of these terms appear in the letter to the Philippians, you say that there's no evidence in Philippi that these are used to refer to the imperial cult. Very interesting argument in the book. I want you to explain that to us.
Yeah, so the first thing is that the translation of divus or diva into Greek is not kurios or kuria. It is, it would be theos or thea. So that's the first thing, is you look at actually what the Philippians called the emperors to whom they gave divine honors, and they called them divus and diva. So Greek speakers would have called them They were called a male, a theos, or thea. Would have not have called them kurios. That's the first thing. And that's widely attested. I mean, you can just look around at specifically parallel inscriptions. So if you look at, for example, the res gestae, which is the great deeds that Augustus did that he had published after his death, and the most complete one is from Ankara in Turkey, and there's a complete Greek version, a complete Latin version. It shows you the parallels and kind of how they translated, and Deus is translated as theos in that particular document. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is you actually look in the material record. They do call emperors to whom they gave divine honors Diwa, or Deus and Diwa, but they don't call them kurios. And it's not until, or the Latin version, which would be Dominus. It's not until Constantine. He's the first emperor in the historical record from Philippi to be called Lord. And by that time, it doesn't mean what it meant for Jesus. It's just a sort of a polite title in that particular case. And so if you just look at what was going on the ground, and now granted, we don't have everything from Philippi, but I mean, I do, it's like 20 something inscriptions that I quote. All dating to the first century. That's a pretty good swath. So I feel pretty confident in saying that, well, for one, if you look at what people were saying, and also if you look, Evangelium which is the Latin version of Evangelion, didn't exist in Latin. So when Cicero in the first century BC is quoting and wants to say good news, he has to, in his document, in the letter that he's writing, he has to actually write in Greek and not in Latin. So that tells me a couple things too, is it just didn't exist in the Latin lexicon. But it doesn't exist in the material culture from the city, and that was my big thing to as I started to see this, as I was going through the inscriptions and doing the hard work of translating them and looking at the coins. I said, "Wow, I don't see any of these terms in here. Maybe this is a fluke." But then I go on to Thessalonica, for example, and I look at those inscriptions, which are in Greek, and those inscriptions aren't there. And it's not until later in the second century that emperors really begin in that particular city to be called kurios. And so it was sort of those two cities combined with some other work that I've done in the past with inscriptions, being able to see just how little evidence there is. The only evidence in the earliest, I'll say, known to date for an emperor being called kurios in mainland Greece dates to AD 67. And it does refer to Nero, but it is in reaction to a significant benefaction that he gave a particular city, and they call him kurios of the entire world. But that is a one-off. It only appears once in his reign, and it's related to the significant benefaction he provided the particular city in question. But there's no other cases from the Julio-Claudian period. As a matter of fact, in my first book, Studying the New Testament Through Inscriptions, when I look at kurios being a title that's kingly, if you look at how it's actually used, it's one of these practices that most people think that the influence went Rome and then went around the empire. And that's just not the case in antiquity. Everybody was influencing everyone. And so if you look in the idea of calling an emperor Lord, is an idea that originates because of the ancient Near East, and I mean going back to the Code of Hammurabi and all the ancient Near Eastern, great ancient Near Eastern kings that I'm not really qualified to talk about because I'm not a specialist in that area. But if you look at ancient Near Eastern pictures, or if you look at what's that one document there, one collection, it's like 4 different of the volumes of the ancient sources of inscriptions and texts from the ancient Near East. It's very common in those documents for someone to call the king of Babylon or Acadia, it doesn't matter, as Lord. And so when you look at how Lord began to be used for the Roman emperor, it's a practice that actually began in those areas that were part of the ancient Near East, ancient Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. And then it spreads out towards Rome, and then it becomes pretty common after the reign of Nero in particular to call an emperor Lord. And so one inscription from Greece that dates a few years after St. Paul was martyred in Rome is not enough information and not enough data, in my opinion, to warrant the oft-repeated conclusion that kurios is an imperial term. The same way with Evangelion. I've done the research. I've only found 3 inscriptions, 3 total. So those articles by N.T. Wright, he quotes everything that we have, and there's nothing else out there. I may have missed something, but I've done a pretty comprehensive search and I've been doing it for years. And I would love for another inscription to be found and prove me wrong. But I mean, if you just look at how the term is used, if you just do a search in an epigraphy database, for example, it is used for just general things. Givings. It's used in Thessalonica to refer to gods of Thanksgiving in the 2nd century. So not the first, but it doesn't appear in either Philippi or Thessalonica. And the one source that it appears in, mainly there's a few, but the main source is a document that is related to imperial divine honors. And that's why people latch on to it, because the birth of Augustus is called good news. But there's a difference in a term being used to refer to an emperor's birth as good news and a term that is a technical term. And it is not a technical term. It gets used everywhere. So I just push back against that to try to be as precise as possible.
That makes a lot of sense, but it would lead some people to ask them, well, okay, if these aren't technical terms that are a challenge to the imperial cult, then why exactly were the Christians in trouble in Philippi?
Yeah, that's so I think they were in trouble because, and the argument that I'm making in that particular chapter is that by accepting the gospel in a Roman colony, that St. Luke knows the charge brought against St. Paul and St. Silas was that they were advocating customs unlawful for we Romans to accept and practice. That accepting the gospel meant choosing to live a life that was counter to that prevailing dominant Roman culture that was propagated in that town, in that city, in that colony, which was founded to be that, a centerpiece and an area of influence for Rome. Here's where sort of I push back and also include, which would include Roman imperial divine honors, but not be limited to them. So it's the larger culture of the city that Christians are rejecting as they become Christians. And so that's sort of the real rub, I think, with the Christians in Philippi. It didn't help that when Christianity was first brought there, that St. Paul gets brought before the duum weary and gets caned as long as St. Silas. So it kind of gets people alerted to these people are a little weird and the charge sticks, I think. And so that's sort of why Christians are suffering. So when St. Paul writes to them in the letter to the Philippians and says that some of them are in prison, according to Philippians chapter 1, in verse 30, they're suffering the same thing he's suffering while he's in prison, I think is related to this idea that they're pushing back against the larger dominant Roman culture with the gospel, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, you move into Thessalonians after that, the Thessalonica, the city, which obviously Paul wrote the letter to the Thessalonians, to that city there. How were imperial divine honors understood differently in Thessalonica than they were in Philippi?
Yeah, I guess it's one of the great things about this book is I got to actually see, and it was beautiful to see just the diversity. So unlike Philippi, which we just left, and unlike Corinth, to which we'll go later in the podcast, Thessalonica was and remained a Greek city throughout its history. So when it was founded, 316, 315 BC, all the way up to now, it still remains a Greek city. And Greeks differed from Romans in many customs and traditions. The 2nd century author Plutarch, he even had a book that he wrote about basically the ways in which for Greeks, the ways in which Greeks differ from Romans. So it's something everyone saw, that it's really clear that Romans dress differently, they act differently, they do different things. And some of those different things included imperial divine honors. So unlike Philippi, where most of the evidence from Corinth, inscriptions in Thessalonica are in Greek, which is important. They're not in Latin as they are in Philippi and in Corinth, although there are a smattering of Greek inscriptions, most of which are in Corinth, most of which are related to the games that were held. But But if you look at Thessalonica, unlike in Philippi, where emperors were worshipped after their death, and because the Senate in Rome divinized them, in Thessalonica, emperors were worshipped in their lifetime, but not every single one. It's only those people that provided substantial benefactions, like Augustus, Claudius, Augustus' wife Livia. And so those people are worshipped while they are alive. But it's really fascinating that Thessalonica, unlike other Greek cities in other parts of mainland Greece and Asia Minor, Thessalonica did not call these emperors whom they worshipped as God, like gods while they were alive, gods, with the exception of Augustus's wife Livia, until after they died. So they will have a cultic statue of Augustus. There's a temple of Augustus, or there are two temples of Augustus, possibly three that I talk about in the book. That most people only think there's one. There was definitely two, possibly three. Even though they erect these temples, they don't call Augustus a god until he dies.
Yeah. You also, well, this one's a little bit interesting too, because in the Thessalonian correspondence, Paul actually uses the term kingdom of God. Basileia is the Greek term behind that. And it's one of the instances in Paul where we kind of see him, I think, referring back to the Jesus tradition of bringing the kingdom of God and all that stuff. But you do argue in your book that term Basileia, or kingdom, could actually conflict with Roman imperial ideology. So there might actually be like a linguistic point of conflict there. So walk us through that. What's significant about the term Basileia that puts it in contrast to Roman imperial ideology?
Yeah, it was sort of one of these things that, once again, I'm interpreting things contextually. So I don't find any evidence for that in Philippi. I don't find any evidence for that in Corinth. But if you look at the inscriptions, and we've got 3 volumes of inscriptions from Thessalonica. If you look at the inscriptions, there are inscriptions that use Basileia, Basileus, Basileo. And so there are inscriptions, particularly because the city was founded by the Macedonian, the city was founded by the brother-in-law of Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian king. And so that particular city gets founded by a king. It's part of the Macedonian kingdom. And we know that, for example, in the 2nd century AD, there was a revival of this Macedonian Greek heritage in the city itself, which included bestowing posthumous divine honors on Alexander the Great. So you'll read in some commentaries that Alexander the Great was worshipped since the 4th century BC in the city, and it's not the case. All the evidence in the city for him dates to the 2nd century AD. So it's this larger revival. And so you've got this sort of cultural memory in the city of being ruled by kings that really gets ramped up for reasons we don't know in the 2nd century. And so I don't think that the Thessalonians ever forgot about that. I think they understood what Basileia meant. And so taking that into account, I think that the earliest Christians in the city were going around proclaiming the kingdom of God, just like St. Paul was. And so that impending culmination of the kingdom of God would have resulted in friction because they've been saying this is a different kingdom. People knew exactly what a kingdom was.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, when we come to Corinth, we have a completely different situation, and even superficially, if you read through the letters of Paul in the New Testament, Corinth is not like the other letter. Like our 1st and 2nd Corinthians are not like the other Pauline letters. Maybe 2nd Corinthians is a little bit closer, but in 1st Corinthians, Paul deals with a number of problems in a sequential order, and so it's got a different feel than the other Pauline literature. And you argue, and I think this is just a true claim on the face of it, that there's like no evidence of any conflict between the church and imperial divine honors in either 1st or 2nd Corinthians. So, what should we make of that? And then how should we understand the problems that the Christians in Corinth were actually facing?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out too that also in that particular, in 1 Corinthians, that is the document that shows the most interactions between Christians and pagans in the city. And so you've got pagans who can come and go to a Christian assembly. You got Christians dining with pagans. You've got Christians taking Christians to court before pagans. You even have Christians married to non-pagans. But still, in that particular document, there's no evidence that any conflict is external. It's all internal within the church. And so I think what we can make of that, and I borrow from John Barclay here, John M.G. Barclay, a big fan of his. I'm inspired by him. He does really good work, and I always try to sort of be like John Barclay. You can't go wrong if you do good work like John Barclay. He argues that the Corinthian Christians, evidently in an article that was published years ago, that they would basically be Christian in the church, and then when they would go out of the church, they would just kind of get back to their pagan lifestyle. And so I argue because of that it seems to me that the Corinthian Christians, just like their pagan counterparts, they just didn't comprehend the apocalyptic countercultural nature of the gospel, which the Philippians got, because it caused them problems, and the Thessalonians got it, caused them problems. And so it seems to me that if the Corinthians changed their ways and did what St. Paul told them to do, it would have actually caused more conflict for them externally. So they quelled the internal conflict, but actually caused some external conflict there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, what makes Corinth a much different city in which to be a Christian than Philippi or Thessalonica? What's unique about Corinth as a city?
Yeah, so unlike Philippi, it's founded in the 4th century BC, and Thessalonica the same way. I mean, you're looking at a city who stretches back all the way to the Trojan War. That city sent people to fight in the Trojan War. And so you're looking at a city with an illustrious history, which it really bleeds, even though it becomes a colony of Rome, unlike in Philippi, which pretty much erases the Greek city that existed before it. Greek Corinth pushes back and says, we're not going away. We have existed for a long time. We sent men to the Trojan War, and we're going to continue to have just a tad bit of this Greek culture in this colony of Rome. Part of that also is that Corinth is different in that it is situated on 2 harbors. And so it's a prosperous trading city. And so that just means there's a lot more people coming and going in Corinth than there would have been in Thessalonica and in Philippi. So it's just a lot more cosmopolitan. And so it creates its own sort of, it's more, in a way, I would say, unlike in Philippi, where St. Paul and St. Silas get accused of advocating customs that we Romans cannot accept or practice. That never happens in Corinth. According to St. Luke, it's an attack made by Jews who do not accept Jesus as the Messiah, who cause problems for Paul, and then basically the Romans don't really care. So it seems to me that from what we know of the city, people coming and going all the time. So you had, strange cults with how they would have seen things. Strange cults come and go, strange people come and go. And so I think that's kind of the ethos. It's more laid back and open to change than a small little Roman colony like Philippi, basically.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense of all 3 of those cities. And I think by this point in our conversation, everyone should be able to see that there is a lot of diversity within the Greco-Roman world between the ways that people would have understood imperial divine honors and the cult to Caesar. I want to come back to N.T. Wright, and kind of as we have a couple minutes left here, I want to talk more about that really debate between Paul and Empire and New Testament scholarship and kind of what your research represents for that debate. N.T. Wright is obviously probably the most influential New Testament scholar in the world, especially among practicing Christians. And for me, just personally, I'm not sure how you feel about this. I'd actually be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I've always found Wright's work on the Gospels to be very, very compelling. I've been a lot more skeptical of his work on Paul. And even when I read through his big book, Paul and the Faithfulness of God, one of the problems, as you identify in your book with N.T. Wright, is that he just makes these massive sweeping claims about the way that people thought in the ancient world, about how Paul would have interacted with those people. And some of them they just don't seem to have the weight of evidence behind them. And one of the claims that N.T. Wright makes a lot has to do with the fact that Caesars regularly divinized themselves, that every single Roman emperor from Augustus on appropriated those divine titles for themselves. And as you've kind of been claiming throughout the book, there's kind of a sub theme going along with the imperial divine honors. There's just no historical evidence for that at all. So explain that to my audience. What is the lacuna there in the historical evidence for the claim that Wright makes that all of these emperors are just claiming to be divine beings?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I agree with you. I like Wright on the Gospels, and I like it for some things on Paul. I just wish, it'd be just a little more careful. That's all I really want, is to be more careful. And so part of that carefulness is just actually reading the ancient sources, the ancient primary sources. I will never forget, I was watching a lecture with him at Harvard, and somebody had talked about a primary source that is the Potter's Oracle, dates around 31 BC, and it's basically a Greek apocalyptic document that's pagan. And I remember seeing just him be shocked that this document existed, and he had never read or heard of it. And he talks a lot about apocalyptic, has his own unique and nuanced understanding of it. And so for me, that's kind of, I just don't think he spends as much time in the primary sources, and not in particular in the bound primary sources. So if it's not in a little classical library, or if it's not the Bible, he just doesn't spend that much time in it. And I mean, I can understand that. I mean, he's a really good, systematizer and those types of things. But when you actually read the ancient sources, and you actually read the ancient inscriptions, and you look at the ancient papyri, and you look at the ancient archaeological data that we have, I mean, it's just like he's building up straw men that he gets to knock down really, really easily. And to me, that doesn't really serve the church, and it doesn't really serve the academy either. But I'm most concerned now about the church. It doesn't really serve the church to build up something that didn't exist. And so I just would wish that, for people who want to know more about the ancient world, I would read classicists. That's what I do.
Yeah.
I read Simon Price. I read Mary Beard. I read these types of people. John Maw is he's not up and coming. He's become sort of the premier classicist, I think. So, I mean, those people are the people that I learn the most from, and then I find I can bring the most to. And then read the primary sources anytime you can get them. There are great source books out there. You can just get collections of, and just read them for yourself. I mean, you don't really have to have a PhD to do that. And you can just see for yourself, man, how this is super diverse. I would get a hold of every source book I could when I first started my Master of Divinity and just read ancient sources. I had a professor in my Master of Divinity said one primary source is worth more than what 10,000 secondary sources say about it. And I've always taken that to heart.
Yeah. And the great thing about that for people that are intimidated or daunted by reading the primary sources is that you do have classicists like Mary Beard who write popular level surveys of like the Roman Empire. Yeah. So if you're completely lost, you can pick up one of those popular level books, kind of get a sense of orientation, and it makes diving into that primary source literature a lot easier. The other thing go ahead.
I was going to say, just one plug, Adrian Goldsworthy is an amazing Roman historian who really makes things readable and approachable.
Yeah. The other thing I want to ask you too, before we move into the Paul and Empire stuff here, as we usually wrap up too, there's just a theory I want to run by you, since you're a New Testament scholar and you've read a lot of the literature. My particular thought on Wright, because when I was going through Bible college, I started in 2007. N.T. Wright was like the guy, so I read a lot of his work back then. But I get a sense that like in his earlier work, he's much more precise and nuanced, and he seems to really appeal to the sources. And then I know that it was around that time that he became a bishop or something like that, and he had to step away from academics. And it seems like everything that he's produced since then has been a lot more general and kind of geared towards a popular audience. Do you get that perspective from him, or is that just me?
No, I mean, he's one of the, like I said, he's the number one New Testament scholar in the world. And he writes a book every 6 months, it seems. Right. I was amazed when in like maybe June or July of 2020, all of a sudden there's a book by N.T. Wright about COVID. And, so in a way, I really appreciate that he can reach so many people. And I appreciate the hard work he's done for the church and condensing things down and systematizing them and making them presentable. And the people who are more faithful Christians today because of him. I'm so appreciative of that. I think at the same time, you can do that type of thing. And that's what I eventually would like to do if I ever can quit a job or two that I have. I think you can do all those things and still be as accurate as you can be. You just don't have to say things that are sweeping generalizations.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I do feel like the Paul and Empire debate now is kind of framed by two different approaches, and the two scholars I've had Christoph Heilig on. He's one of them, and then
Yeah.
Najib Haddad, who we're working on getting something together for the show. But those
Yeah.
are kind of the two poles of I think where the conversation's at. Where Christoph Heilig accepts the fact that Paul does have some sort of unease or tension with the Roman Empire, but he really does try to present a more nuanced case for that. And then you have Najib Haddad on the other side of that conversation. And his books have been like, I think he makes some very compelling arguments where he says it doesn't really seem like Paul is that confrontational with Rome, and he just seems to consign the Roman imperial order to the old creation that's passing away. And one day it'll be done away with, and the Christians don't really need to concern themselves with that. So where does your book fit into that conversation on Paul and empire? And what impact would you like for it to have on that debate?
Yeah, so I think my book enters into that debate in a more specific, nuanced way, and it sort of looks at how Greeks and Romans in the three cities of mainland Greece in which I focus worship the Julio-Claudian emperors and their family members. And I think it's just really striking just to step back and just to note that all three of these cities bestowed divine honors on several Julio-Claudians, especially Augustus. Most of the evidence for every city, the majority of the evidence always points back to him. And they did so because, and to varying degrees and for varying reasons, they did so because Augustus made their life easier. The empire is more peaceful. People had a better quality of life. Things were more profitable than they had been. And so those people who lived in Philippi, Corinth, and Thessalonica in particular, I'm sure they appreciated that. And so in my opinion, I think that in general, Christianity's rejection of the pagan gods, including imperial divine honors and overtly pagan aspects of Greco-Roman culture, which I think we get in 1 Corinthians, that Paul sort of draws his lines in the sand, that those are going to cause conflict because it calls into existence the gods who, according to pagans, were the source of peace and prosperity, and it rejected certain long-term customs and traditions that these particular cities had. So I don't think Christianity is necessarily anti-Roman, because we forget that the Romans openly admitted that they borrowed much from the Greeks, and that some of the cities in the Greek East, they existed long before Rome ever conquered them, and they remained Greek even after Rome came. And so you also have this aspect that there are many aspects of Greek and Roman culture that Christians adopted. St. Paul writes in Greek. He also is quite fond of Stoicism, even though I think it's an apocalyptically interpreted Stoicism. It is Stoicism nonetheless. I don't know if he knew it was Stoicism, but he certainly got it there. It's in his epistles, and there's been good work that's been done on that. So I think what I would say is that that Christianity was anti certain aspects of Greek and Roman culture, and I hope that's what my book is able to bring out. Not everything is bad. I do think that everything's going to pass away, and you don't need to be concerned about it. But there are certain aspects, I think, where Paul will take a hard line in the sand, but those aren't necessarily around anti-Roman things. It's just around anti-God, anti-gospel things. And so, like many Christians today, I would say that Christians in antiquity sometimes watered down this apocalyptically countercultural nature of the gospel. And so that's where you get sometimes, like in Corinth, there's no conflict, but there is conflict in Philippi and there is conflict in Thessalonica. So I hope my book is able to show that and able to maybe make the question more precise and see that you just can't paint with broad brushstrokes.
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense. Well, the last question that I want to ask you has to do with practical application, because as Christians, obviously, and it's very complicated in the way we do this, and there are a million different ways that people have tried. We have to apply the teachings of the Bible to our modern life. So for someone that reads your book, what do you think and we'll make this even more specific contextually for an American that reads your book, how should we apply the lessons that we learn from this book to the way that we understand like politics and culture in the United States today?
Yeah, I think the first lesson we can learn is that the world of ancient Christianity, just like our own world, is complex. we cannot, I don't think, and we must not paint in broad brushstrokes. So that world, or our world, which kind of forces people into opposing camps, dismisses this group of people because they don't share our larger cultural, political, or tertiary theological views, not the primary ones, like the ones that creeds are based on. What the church and the world need right now, I think, and what I hope my book helps people to see, they need Christians who will not cooperate in this larger trend of dismissal with broad brushstrokes, but who'll do the hard countercultural work of getting to know the people with whom they disagree, these people who are men and women created in God's own image. And so if I would hope my book starts to do that, and to see that Paul is really, although the gospel speaks to politics, it's not that Paul doesn't use the gospel for his own political ends. I think the gospel is countercultural. It's apocalyptic. I do appreciate Hadid's work, and that this world is passing away. And so Christians need to always keep that larger teleological view in mind of the end of new creation fully dawning. And number one, just kind of keeps things in a perspective. And when you see the end, you can kind of just have a better perspective about what really matters and what you should do. So I hope it can bring some peace, I guess, my book, and just to seeing that, things are a lot more complicated, and we just need to sit down and actually get to know people before we dismiss them. That's kind of what I would say, just given our cultural moment that we're in, where nobody wants to talk to anybody who holds a view that's different than theirs. Everybody paints this group with a broad brushstroke and all those types of things. There's a great quote that I have in the email, in my signature in my private email, and it's a tribute to Abraham Lincoln, and it says, "I don't like that man. I must get to know him better."
Yeah, and that's powerful. That's powerful.
Oh, I think so. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end it. Well, Dr. Clint Burnett, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah.
Again, the book is Paul and Imperial Divine Honors, out now on Eerdmans Press. Before I let you go, where can people find and follow you?
Yeah, so I blog at clintburnett.com, and you can find me on X at dclintburnett, or you can email me at davidclintburnett@gmail.com. I answer people's emails all the time. I love getting emails because I don't teach, and unfortunately, and so right now, and so I love when people write and ask me things. So yeah.
Well, Clint, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you. Godspeed to you, and God bless you. Thanks, Alex, for the time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.